The base fell silent at 400 hours. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the hollow, suffocating kind that arrives when hope has been packed into body bags and shipped home. Forward operating base Kestrel sat 40 miles from enemy lines, a collection of prefab structures and radar arrays that had seen better wars. In the operations center, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Valerio stood before a tactical display that told a story no one wanted to read. 3 aircraft lost. 7 pilots missing. The enemy's new SAM systems had turned the sky into a graveyard. Outside, beneath a maintenance hangar's flickering fluorescent lights, someone was still working. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed across the tarmac, a sound so persistent that the night watch had stopped investigating hours ago. They knew who it was. They always knew. Senior Airman Rena Kolikov had been under that F-16 for 16 straight hours, her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and something darker that might have been blood from scraped knuckles. The aircraft above her had been written off by 3 separate maintenance officers: structural damage to the port wing root, compromised avionics suite, a fire suppression system that had cooked itself during an emergency landing 2 days prior. The jet was a memorial now, not a weapon. But Rena had flown it once. 7 years ago, before an incident in the Kandahar Valley had ended her piloting career and left her with a medical discharge from flight status that no appeal could overturn. Now she turned wrenches instead of sticks, diagnosed engine failures instead of enemy movements. The other mechanics called her Groundhog with barely concealed pity. The pilots didn't call her anything at all. She was invisible to them, a ghost who had failed some test of courage they'd all passed. What none of them knew, what the classified file in Colonel Valerio's safe would never tell them, was that Rena Kolikov held the record for the longest solo combat mission in theater history. 11 hours airborne after her wingman went down. 4 confirmed kills while flying on fumes and a damaged targeting system. She'd brought that burning aircraft home through a sandstorm, landed it with no hydraulics, and walked away with a shattered vertebra she'd hidden from the flight surgeon for 3 days. The injury had healed wrong. The paperwork had been unforgiving. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands moved with the precision of someone who remembered what it meant to trust your life to every bolt and wire. The wrench slipped. She cursed softly in Russian, a habit from her grandmother's kitchen in Brooklyn. Above her, the F-16 waited like a sleeping predator. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way the radio chatter had changed over the past week, in the way the pilots walked a little faster to their briefings, in the way Colonel Valerio had looked at that broken jet yesterday, his expression unreadable, before walking away without saying a word. Rena tightened another bolt and wondered if anyone would listen when the time came. The situation briefing at 6:30 was supposed to be routine. Intelligence updates, weather reports, the usual litany of restricted airspace and revised rules of engagement. Instead, Colonel Valerio stood before his assembled pilots with the expression of a man watching his own funeral. The satellite imagery on the screen behind him showed a column of enemy armor that stretched for miles, heading straight for a refugee corridor where 30,000 civilians were trapped between the advancing forces and the mountains. "We have 18 hours," Valerio said. His voice carried the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. "After that, those people disappear into a war crime we'll be explaining to Congress for the next decade." Captain Joel Thorne, call sign Reaper, spoke up from the front row. He was the kind of pilot who collected confirmed kills like baseball cards and wore his confidence like body armor. "Sir, with respect, we're down to 4 operational aircraft. We can barely maintain a combat air patrol, let alone mount an effective strike package against mobile armor with that kind of SAM coverage." The silence that followed was answer enough. Every person in that room knew the mathematics of modern air warfare. 4 jets against an integrated air defense network, enemy fighters on standby, and terrain that turned radar tracking into an educated guessing game. It wasn't a mission. It was a suicide note written in jet fuel. Major Keiko Sato, Blade, leaned back in her chair. She was methodical where Thorne was aggressive, a precision instrument who calculated angles and probabilities before committing to anything. The AO-68 corridor has 3 natural choke points. If we had ground attack ordnance and jamming support, we could theoretically bottle them up long enough for the civilians to move. Theoretically. But we'd need at least 6 aircraft to rotate coverage and manage the threat environment. We don't have 6. We have 5, a voice said from the doorway. Every head turned. Rena Kolikov stood in the entrance, still wearing her maintenance coveralls, a grease-stained rag hanging from her pocket. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, which was accurate. The expression on her face was the one she'd worn when diagnosing a fouled fuel pump, all business, no emotion. Tail number 478 is airworthy, she continued, walking into the room with the kind of presence that made senior officers forget about protocol. I've been rebuilding it around the clock. New wing root assembly, full avionics diagnostic fire suppression system replaced. I test-fired the systems an hour ago. She's ready. Reaper actually laughed. That's the jet that Martinez pancaked into the runway with half its stabilizer missing. Nobody's flying that death trap. Rena's eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a targeting laser. I am. The room erupted. Pilots talking over each other, Valerio raising his hand for silence, someone mentioning medical clearances and chain of command. Through it all, Rena stood perfectly still, waiting for the noise to mean something. It was Blade who cut through the chaos. You're not flight qualified. You haven't been in a cockpit in 7 years. And even if we ignored every regulation in the book, this mission needs combat-experienced pilots who know how to work as a package. No offense, airman, but rebuilding an engine doesn't make you a fighter pilot. I know, Rena said quietly. I used to be one. The silence that fell this time was different, heavier. Colonel Valerio closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man who'd hoped this moment would never come. Her call sign was Ironside, Valerio said. She flew the Kandahar Valley mission, the one we don't talk about. Recognition dawned slowly across the room. The mission had become legend in the informal way that stories do when the official reports are classified. A pilot who'd stayed up alone for 11 hours, protecting a ground unit that would have been overrun without air support. Some versions claimed 6 kills, others said 8. All of them ended with an aircraft that should have fallen from the sky but somehow didn't. Reaper's expression shifted from mockery to something more complicated. You're that Kolikov. I was, Rena said. Then I broke my back on the landing. Medical discharge from flight status. But the jet I'm offering you isn't broken anymore. And right now, those civilians don't care about my medical records. They need aircraft overhead, and I'm giving you one more option than you had 5 minutes ago. Blade studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who understood risk in terms of angles and velocities. Can you even pass a flight physical at this point? No, Rena admitted, but I can fly. The distinction hung in the air like cordite smoke. Valerio looked at the tactical display, at the countdown timer showing 17 hours and 43 minutes, at the faces of pilots who were all thinking the same impossible mathematics. 4 jets were a gesture. 5 was barely a fighting chance. But it was more chance than 30,000 people had right now. This is insane, Reaper muttered, but his tone had lost its certainty. Valerio turned to Rena. If I put you in that cockpit, you understand what you're walking into. The SAM coverage alone. I've read the briefings, Rena interrupted. I've been reading them every day while I fixed your jets. I know what's out there. Then you know this isn't about proving something. This is about bringing assets home and protecting civilians. If you can't do both, you're a liability, not an asset. Rena met his gaze without flinching. Colonel, I've spent 7 years making sure every pilot on this base comes home alive. Let me do it from the air for once. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Every pilot present had been touched by her work at some point, An engine that shouldn't have restarted. A hydraulic leak caught before it became catastrophic. A pre-flight inspection that found the fault nobody else had seen. She'd been keeping them alive all along, just from the ground instead of the sky. Valerio made his decision in the silence between heartbeats. You'll fly as number 5 in the strike package. Blade leads, you follow her instructions precisely. First sign your aircraft isn't performing or you can't keep up with the formation, you return to base immediately. Understood? Yes, sir. And Kalikov, Valerio's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Welcome back to flight status. The briefing that followed was the most detailed Rena had attended in years, and it painted a picture of the kind of mission that aviation historians would later describe using words like audacious and desperate. The enemy column was protected by a mobile SAM network that had already claimed 3 kills. The SA-15 gauntlet systems that could track multiple targets while moving at speed. Intelligence suggested at least 2 enemy fighters on QRA at an airbase 30 miles northeast, modern interceptors that would arrive within minutes of any engagement. The plan was simple in the way that terrible ideas often are. The 5-ship would approach from the west at low altitude, threading through mountain valleys to avoid radar detection. At the first choke point, they'd execute a pop-up strike against the lead elements of the column, then egress south before the SAM network could establish a firing solution. If everything went perfectly, they'd buy the civilians 12 hours to clear the corridor. Nobody mentioned what happened if things didn't go perfectly. Blade walked the team through the attack geometry using a 3-dimensional tactical display. We hit them in sequence. Reaper, you're first in with cluster munitions on the lead vehicles. I'll follow with precision strikes on any SAM units that light up. Falcon, you're carrying anti-radiation missiles for SAM suppression. Tempest, you've got the secondary choke point if they try to disperse. And Ironside. She paused, using the call sign with the careful formality of someone acknowledging a ghost made real. You're our eyes high. You'll maintain a racetrack pattern above the engagement zone, call out threats, and provide top cover if those fighters scramble. It was the safest position in the package, which everyone in the room understood was Blade's way of protecting an asset she didn't entirely trust yet. Rena nodded, accepting the assignment without comment. Time on target is 1400 hours, Blade continued. That gives us 7 hours to prep brief and get airborne. Weather is VFR, but expect turbulence in the valleys. Rules of engagement are weapons free on confirmed military targets only. If you can't identify it as hostile, you don't shoot it. Questions? Reaper raised a hand. What's our recovery plan if the SAMs get a lock before we're clear? Blade's smile was thin and utterly devoid of humor. Fly better. The laughter that followed was brief and bitter, the kind of gallows humor that combat pilots use to acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. They filed out in small groups, heading toward the flight line where their aircraft waited like patient predators. Rena remained behind, studying the tactical display with an intensity that made the map glow in her vision. 7 years away from the cockpit, and the rhythms of aerial warfare came flooding back with brutal clarity. She could see the approach angles, the timing windows, the dozen ways this mission could collapse into chaos. But she could also see the thread of possibility, narrow, treacherous, and real, that led to success. Having second thoughts, Valerio asked from behind her. Just first thoughts, Rena said. It's been a while. Your jet checks out. Every system. She turned to face him. Sir, why didn't you tell them about Kandahar, about what really happened? Valerio was quiet for a long moment. Because that mission cost you everything. Your career, your health, 7 years of watching other people fly. I had no right to use it as currency to put you back in danger. But you're letting me fly anyway. Because 30,000 people don't have time for my conscience. He met her eyes. But Kalikov, when this is over, if we're both here when it's over, we're having a conversation about what really happened that day. The full story. The one that's not in my classified file. Rena felt something shift in her chest, a weight she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten it was removable. Deal. She walked out into the morning sun, where her F-16 waited on the hardstand like an extension of her own well-made metal. The other pilots were clustered around their aircraft, conducting pre-flight inspections with the focused intensity of rituals performed before battle. Reaper looked up as she approached. For a moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. That's some resurrection work you did on 478. She wanted to fly again, Rena said simply. I just helped her remember how. The pilot's briefing room at 1200 hours was thick with tension that could be carved with a knife. 5 pilots, 5 aircraft, and a mission that violated every principle of safe aerial warfare. Blade stood at the front, her usual precision now honed to an edge sharp enough to cut through doubt. Final weather check shows wind shift in the target area, she announced. Gusting to 25 knots from the northwest. That'll push us off our egress line if we're not careful. Compensate early. Rena sat in the back row, flight suit freshly donned, her helmet bag at her feet. The suit felt foreign after years of coveralls, but her hands remembered how to adjust the straps, how to check the survival vest pockets by touch. Muscle memory was a strange thing. It survived even when everything else was stripped away. Ironside, Blade said, pulling Rena's attention forward. Your racetrack pattern puts you at Angels 20, offset 3 miles west of the target area. You'll be alone up there. If the fighters scramble, you're the first contact. Can you handle that? The question was professional, but the subtext was clear. Are you ready to kill again? Are you ready to be the person you were before the injury, before the discharge, before 7 years of invisibility? Yes, Rena said. The word came out steady, certain. I can handle it. Falcon, call sign for Captain Tim Devereaux, a lanky weapons officer with Louisiana in his vowels, spoke up. What's our contingency if they've repositioned those SAM systems? Intel's 3 days old. They could be anywhere. Then we improvise, Blade said flatly. This isn't a training exercise where we get to restart if we don't like the initial conditions. We go in with what we know, adapt to what we find, and complete the mission. That's the job. The finality in her voice ended the questioning. They filed out toward the flight line, each pilot alone with thoughts they wouldn't share until much later, if ever. On the hardstand, Rena conducted her walk-around inspection with the thoroughness of someone who'd rebuilt every system herself. She knew where every bolt had been torqued, every wire secured, every fluid line replaced. The aircraft was an extension of her own body now, and she moved around it with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend after a long absence. The crew chief, a young sergeant named Holloway, approached with her clipboard. All systems green, ma'am. Weapons are loaded and safed. Fuel topped off. She's ready. Rena paused, nodding the ma'am that had replaced the usual airman. Word had spread. The mechanic who'd been invisible was suddenly visible again, and the shift in protocol felt like stepping into a uniform that had been hanging in a closet too long. Thanks, Holloway. Take care of her while I'm gone. Always do, ma'am. The sergeant hesitated. And ma'am, bring yourself back too. Rena climbed the ladder into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with a sensation that was part homecoming, part haunting. The instruments glowed with familiar light. Her hands found the controls without conscious thought, checking stick tension, rudder response, throttle smoothness. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the pilot who'd been away too long. The radio crackled to life. Viper flight, this is Tower. Weather update shows clear skies to target area. Winds aloft 270 at 45 knots. Current time is 12:47 local. You're cleared to start engines at pilot discretion. Blade's voice came through first. Viper 1, engine start. The other pilots followed in sequence. When it came to Rena's turn, she keyed her mic with fingers that had forgotten how to shake. Viper 5 engine start. The F-16's engine wound up with a rising shriek that drowned out thought. The vibration traveled through the airframe and into her spine, a sensation she dreamed about for 7 years in the same way amputees dream of phantom limbs. This was real. This was happening. This was the moment where all the work, all the silence, all the invisible years of keeping others alive crystallized into action. Viper Flight Tower, winds 020 at 12 knots, runway 36 available, you're cleared to taxi when ready. They moved out in sequence, 5 aircraft forming a loose formation on the taxiway. Rena followed Tempest's jet, call sign for Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who flew with the smooth efficiency of someone born for the role. The runway stretched ahead like a bridge between 2 different versions of herself. Viper 1 is ready. Viper 2 ready. Viper 3 ready. Viper 4 ready. The pause before Rena's call was microscopic, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't listening for it. Viper 5 ready. Viper Flight, you're cleared for takeoff. Winds light and variable, good hunting. Blade's F-16 advanced to the runway, paused for a final check, then unleashed full thrust. The afterburner lit up like a star being born, and the aircraft leaped forward with violent grace. One by one, the others followed. When Rena's turn came, she advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the engine's response through every nerve ending. The jet accelerated with the smooth inevitability of physics, and then the wheels lifted and there was only sky. 7 years fell away in seconds. The ground dropped below, the horizon expanded, and Rena Kalikov remembered what it meant to fly. The mountains rose ahead like the spine of some ancient creature, all granite faces and narrow valleys where radar coverage became fragmented. Viper Flight descended to 500 feet above the terrain, threading through passes with a precision that demanded total concentration. Rena held position on Tempest's wing, her aircraft responding to inputs with the sharpness she'd engineered into every control surface. Viper 1, Viper 3, say fuel state. Blade's voice was crisp, professional, the tone of someone managing a complex machine where each component needed constant monitoring. Viper 3 showing 7,000 pounds. Viper 5, 6-8. They were burning fuel faster than the flight plan projected, a consequence of the low altitude and constant maneuvering. Rena ran the calculations automatically, old skills reasserting themselves. They had enough to complete the mission with minimal reserves, assuming no extended combat. Assumptions like that had a way of proving fatal. Contact bearing 045, low altitude, moving fast, Falcon called out. His radar warning receiver had caught something. Could be ground traffic, could be mobile SAM. Viper 1 has nothing on radar, stay sharp. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Every pilot knew that the SA-15 systems could operate in radar-silent mode, using optical tracking until they were ready to engage. Somewhere ahead in those valleys, enemy operators were watching their own screens, waiting for target solutions worth revealing their positions. Rena's eyes swept the landscape below, scattered villages, a river that glinted like molten silver in the afternoon light, roads that could hide anything. She remembered this feeling from Kandahar, the hyper-awareness that came when death might arrive at any moment from any direction. Some people froze under that pressure. Others, like her, became diamond-hard and utterly clear. 2 minutes to waypoint Alpha, Blade announced. Viper 5, break north and establish your patrol pattern. Everyone else, arm weapons and prepare for pop-up. This was it. The moment where the plan met reality and the only thing that mattered was execution. Rena peeled away from the formation, her F-16 climbing toward 20,000 feet while the others descended even lower, becoming shadows skimming the earth. Alone in the sky, she established her racetrack pattern, a lazy figure eight that kept the target area in constant view while maintaining enough altitude to see the entire battlefield. From up here, she could see what the others couldn't: the full scope of the enemy column, the dust trails marking their movement, and the clear evidence that intelligence had been wrong about one critical detail. Viper 1, Viper 5, Rena transmitted. I'm showing at least 6 mobile SAM systems, not 4. They've reinforced the air defense network. Recommend abort or revised approach. The silence that followed contained lifetimes of decision. Below her, 4 aircraft were seconds from committing to an attack against a threat environment twice as dangerous as briefed. Above her, only empty sky and the knowledge that 30,000 civilians were counting on a miracle. Blade's response was measured, deliberate. Viper 1 copies 6 SAMs, proceeding with attack. All aircraft, watch your 6 and trust your countermeasures. Viper 5, call threats as you see them. Viper 5, roger. There was no more time for doubt. Rena watched as Reaper's jet suddenly climbed from the valley floor, a hawk rising to strike. His cluster munitions salvoed off the rails in a rippling sequence, each bomblet following a ballistic arc toward the head of the enemy column. The explosions blossomed like orange flowers across the roadway, and vehicles began to burn. Viper 2, good hits on lead elements. They're stopping. Then the sky lit up with danger. 2 SAM systems activated simultaneously, their radar emissions screaming across Rena's warning receiver. She saw the smoke trails of missiles lifting toward Blade's aircraft, physics and metal accelerating toward intersection. Viper 1 defending. Blade's voice held no panic, only the cold concentration of someone executing procedures drilled into reflex. Her jet threw chaff and flares while braking hard left, pulling G-forces that would leave bruises. The first missile lost track, confused by countermeasures. The second kept coming. Brake right, Rena called, seeing the geometry from her higher vantage point. Blade responded instantly, trusting the call. The missile passed so close that its proximity fuse probably activated, but the warhead detonated behind the aircraft, peppering the tail section with shrapnel instead of destroying it outright. Viper 1 hit minor damage, still combat effective. Falcon's anti-radiation missiles streaked downward, homing on the radar emissions. The SAM sites went dark immediately, operators choosing survival over engagement. But Rena knew they were still there, still dangerous, just waiting for the right moment. Viper 4 engaging secondary target, Tempest announced. Her bombs walked across a concentration of armored vehicles, precision-guided munitions finding targets with surgical accuracy. The enemy column was hemorrhaging now, burning and broken, but not stopped. Never entirely stopped. Rena's radar warning receiver suddenly shrieked a different warning, air-to-air mode, fighter aircraft. Viper 5, I have radar contact bearing 085, high aspect, 30 miles and closing fast. 2 contacts, possibly more. The fighters are scrambling. Viper 1 copies. All aircraft continue engagement. Viper 5, you're cleared to engage if they come within range. If they come within range. The words were permission and challenge both. Rena adjusted her position, turning to put the approaching fighters at her 12 o'clock. Her hands moved through the weapons system interface, setting up an AIM 120 for launch. The AMRAAM was fire-and-forget technology, intelligent metal that could think its way to a target once released. But releasing meant revealing her position, meant committing to combat against aircraft she couldn't see yet, against pilots whose skills were unknown. 7 years ago, she would have fired without hesitation. Now, older and carrying the weight of all those invisible years, she waited. The enemy fighters closed to 20 miles. 15. Rena could see them on radar now, 2 clean returns moving with the confidence of aircraft that own this airspace. Viper 5 has radar lock, requesting clearance to fire. Cleared hot. She pressed the trigger. The AMRAAM dropped away from the rail and immediately ignited, accelerating toward its target with single-minded purpose. 20 seconds later, the second missile followed. She watched the radar returns, counting heartbeats, remembering how this felt. One of the enemy contacts disappeared from her screen. The missile had found its mark. The second contact broke hard, the pilot reacting to warning systems screaming about incoming death. Rena's second missile lost track, confused by aggressive maneuvering and countermeasures. The remaining fighter was still coming, and now it was personal. Viper 5 merged plot, engaging hostile. Rena's voice was steady as stone. The fighter appeared in her vision, a clean, modern design that could probably outturn her F-16 in a sustained fight. But she'd rebuilt this aircraft herself, knew its quirks and capabilities, knew exactly how much she could ask from it. The enemy pilot made his first mistake. He tried to establish a height-low attack, using altitude advantage to dictate the engagement. Rena dove into the valley, using terrain masking to break his radar lock, then popped up behind a ridgeline with the sun at her back. The fight became a knife fight in a phone booth, both aircraft turning hard, each pilot trying to achieve a firing position. Rena's hands worked the controls with the precision of someone playing an instrument they'd mastered long ago. The world narrowed to angles and energy management, to the dance of predator and prey where the roles could reverse in a heartbeat. Her targeting computer achieved tone, that beautiful, terrible sound that meant the enemy was in her sights. The AIM-9 Sidewinder growled its readiness. She waited one more second, letting the geometry perfect itself, then fired. The missile tracked true. The enemy fighter erupted into flame and fell from the sky like a broken promise. Viper 5 Splash 1. Her breathing was controlled, even, as if she'd done this yesterday instead of 7 years ago. Below, the strike package was egressing, running south at low level while more SAM systems lit up behind them. They'd done the job. The enemy column was stopped, burning, buying time for the civilians to escape. But the cost was still being calculated. Viper 3, I've got a hydraulics warning. Flight controls are sluggish. Falcon's voice carried the first hint of strain. His aircraft had taken damage from something, shrapnel, possibly, or a near miss that had caused internal failures. Viper 1, can you maintain formation? Affirmative, but I'm not sure for how long. Rena checked her fuel state. She had maybe 20 minutes before she'd need to head for base herself. Viper 1, Viper 5. I'll drop down and escort Viper 3 home. Negative Viper 5, you're too low on fuel. I'm good, ma'am, let me do this. The pause contained Blade's assessment, tactical, practical, and underneath it all, a recognition of what Rena was really saying. Let me be what I was. Let me keep someone alive. Roger Viper 5, take the trail position. Rena descended to Falcon's altitude, taking up position off his right wing. His aircraft was trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid, the telltale sign of a system slowly bleeding out. They flew in silence through the mountain valleys, two aircraft moving through hostile territory with the knowledge that any moment could bring disaster. Viper 3, how's the jet handling? Like a truck with a broken steering wheel, but she's flying, that's what matters. They cleared the mountains 20 minutes later, emerging over friendlier territory where the sky felt larger and less likely to kill them. The base appeared on the horizon, a collection of structures that represented safety and answers to questions nobody wanted to ask yet. Falcon landed first, his aircraft settling onto the runway with the heavy grace of something that knew it was home. Rena followed, her own landing smooth despite fuel reserves that had entered the critical range. As her wheels touched concrete, she felt something release in her chest, not relief exactly, but the acknowledgement that she'd survived becoming herself again. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. 5 pilots sat in a conference room that smelled like coffee and adrenaline come-down, walking through every moment of the mission with the exhaustive detail that might save lives on the next one. Blade led the discussion with her usual precision, extracting lessons from success and near disaster both. Viper 5's threat calls were critical, she noted, looking directly at Rena. You gave us the situational awareness we needed to adapt to the increased SAM presence. That saved aircraft, probably saved lives. Reaper nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by something harder to define. The air-to-air engagement was textbook. That merge should have been a disaster. You were low on fuel, alone, against an aircraft with equal or better performance. But you flew it perfectly. I flew it desperately, Rena corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Tempest asked. Because from where I was, it looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The words settled into the space between them. Rena realized that something fundamental had shifted in how these pilots saw her. She was no longer Groundhawk, the mechanic who'd failed some test. She was Ironside again, the pilot who'd proven that skill and determination could survive even 7 years in exile. Colonel Valerio entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. Good work out there. Initial reports confirm the enemy column is stopped for at least 12 hours, probably longer. The civilian evacuation is proceeding ahead of schedule. You gave them the time they needed. At what cost, sir? Blade asked. The question was professional, but the weight behind it was personal. Viper 3's aircraft is down for maintenance, hydraulic system failure, just as Falcon reported. Viper 1 took superficial damage that can be repaired overnight. The rest came back clean. Valerio paused. We lost one enemy fighter confirmed, damaged their ground forces significantly, and didn't lose a single pilot. By any measure, that's a win. By any measure except the one that matters, Rena said quietly. We know they'll adapt. They'll reinforce the air defenses, move assets around, make the next mission twice as hard. This isn't over. No, Valerio agreed. It's not. But you bought those civilians time to escape, and you reminded this base what's possible when we refuse to accept the impossible. That matters too. The pilots filed out gradually, each heading toward their own rituals of unwinding from combat. Rena remained behind, staring at the tactical display that showed the results of their mission. 30,000 people were moving south even now, fleeing towards safety that had seemed impossible 12 hours ago. Blade approached, her expression thoughtful. I owe you an apology. For what? For treating you like a liability instead of an asset, for not trusting that you'd remember how to do this. Blade extended her hand. You flew like you never stopped. Rena shook it, feeling the calluses that came from controlling aircraft with precision. I never did stop. Not really. I just had to do it from the ground for a while. Well, welcome back to the air. We need pilots like you, people who understand that the mission matters more than ego. Blade started toward the door, then paused. And Ironside, that call on the defensive brake, that was yours seeing something I missed. You saved my life today. After she left, Rena stood alone with the tactical display and the weight of everything that had happened. 7 years of invisibility, of being the person who kept others alive from the shadows. And now, in the span of a single mission, she'd become visible again, not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it through the only currency that mattered in this world. Competence under fire, grace under pressure, the willingness to risk everything for people who couldn't protect themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Crew Chief Holloway. Aircraft 478 is down for the night. She earned the rest. So did you. Rena smiled, a small expression that felt foreign after years of carefully maintained neutrality. The jet had flown beautifully, every system performing exactly as she'd rebuilt it to perform. In a way, that was the greatest victory, not the confirmed kill or the successful mission, but the proof that her hands could still build something that worked when everything depended on it. Outside, the sun was setting over the base, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Rena walked toward her quarters, passing mechanics and ground crew who nodded with new recognition. She was one of them and apart from them now, existing in that strange space between worlds that belonged to people who'd been both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more missions, more impossible situations, more calculations of fuel and ordnance and human courage. But tonight, she was simply a pilot who'd remembered what it meant to fly, and a mechanic who'd proven that broken things could be made whole again. The sky waited, patient and infinite. It had always been there. She just had to remember how to reach it. The days after the mission developed a rhythm that was part celebration, part preparation for the next impossible task. Intelligence reports confirmed what everyone suspected. The enemy was adapting, reinforcing their air defenses, and moving assets to counter the threat that 5 determined pilots had proven was real. The war continued its grinding mathematics, and Fob Kestrel was still a forward position in a conflict that showed no signs of resolution. But something had changed in the way the base operated. Rena noticed it in small details. The pilots who stopped by the maintenance hangar to check on their aircraft personally. The way Colonel Valerio's morning briefings now included a section on aircraft readiness alongside tactical updates. The gradual shift from seeing maintenance and operations as separate entities to understanding they were parts of the same weapons system. She was working on Reaper's jet, tracing an intermittent electrical fault that had taken hours to isolate, when the pilot himself appeared at her elbow. He watched her work in silence for several minutes before speaking. "I wanted to apologize," Reaper said. His voice carried none of its usual bravado. "For dismissing you in that briefing. For assuming that because you'd been working maintenance, you'd forgotten how to fight." Rena continued her work, hands steady on the multimeter. "You didn't know. Nobody did." "That's not an excuse. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and that's sloppy thinking. My instructor at fighter school would have failed me for that kind of prejudice." He paused. "You flew better than half the pilots I've served with, and you did it after 7 years out of the cockpit. That's not luck. That's skill that runs bone deep." She looked up at him then, seeing past the call sign and the confirmed kills to the person underneath. Someone who was learning the same lesson she'd learned in that Kandahar Valley so many years ago. Competence mattered, but so did humility. The moment you thought you had nothing left to learn was the moment the sky became dangerous. "Your jet's almost done," Rena said, returning to the problem at hand. "The fault was in the backup generator circuit. I'm installing a new relay. You'll have full electrical redundancy by morning." Reaper nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "Blade's planning another mission. Deeper into enemy territory, longer duration. She's asking for you specifically to fly on her wing." Rena's hands paused their work. "My medical clearance was temporary. 1 mission, emergency circumstances. I don't have approval for ongoing flight operations." "Valerio's working on it. The way I hear it, he's calling in favors from medical review boards and citing operational necessity. The man can be persuasive when he wants to be." Reaper's expression turned serious. "But Ironside, when you go up again, and you will, remember that some of us down here depend on you coming back. You're not just a pilot anymore. You're also the person who keeps the rest of us flying. We need both." After he left, Rena sat in the quiet of the hangar, surrounded by the aircraft that had become her life's work. The F-16 above her was silent now, its systems temporarily powered down, but she could feel its potential humming through the metal. These machines were predators that required perfect maintenance to remain lethal. She'd given them that. But she'd also learned to be one of them again, and that knowledge changed the equation in ways that were still unfolding. Her phone buzzed. A message from Valerio. "My office, 800 tomorrow. We need to talk about your future." The meeting happened in Valerio's office, a spare room dominated by tactical displays and the weight of decisions that affected lives measured in dozens. Rena sat across from her commander, her dress uniform crisp and proper, while he reviewed documents on his tablet with the concentrated expression of someone navigating bureaucratic minefields. "I've been fighting with medical review for the past 72 hours, Valerio said without preamble. Your initial clearance was conditional on emergency circumstances that no longer apply. By the book,